Today in the shop, we're installing the engine in our Pro Street G-body. What's up guys? We are back in the shop and today we're going to get the engine installed into the Regal. Before we do that, I want to make a few updates to the engine, starting with porting the intake manifold to make room for a larger throttle body and adding some fuel lines from XRP. The first thing we have to do is get the intake manifold off of the engine and bring it over to the workbench so we can get to porting. Let's get started. Wait, before you go, we just restocked on all your favorite Reckless Regal merch. We have t-shirts, we have stickers, we even have posters like this one. Do us a favor, help us keep videos heading your way, and grab some merch from our store. The link is in the description below. Now, let's get started.
So as you can see, there's a definite lip right here, and this is my mistake. I thought that the LT1 used the same size throttle body as the LS engines do, and I was wrong there. The LT uses an 87mm, whereas the LS, depending on the year, could be 90, could be 92. So this is a 92mm throttle body off of an LS, and we have some issues here. So we're going to pop the intake off, tape off the ports here to make sure nothing falls into the heads, and then take everything over to the workbench, get this throttle body popped off, and we can start porting on this. So to port this, I want to stay inside the gasket material. I want to still retain the OEM O-ring style rubber gasket. So I'm using a couple different carbide burrs here. This first one is a lot more aggressive to just clear the material away. And the second one is a little bit finer, you can see here, and that actually just is smoothing the surface out. And once this is all done, I'll come in with a sanding wheel on the rotary tool, sand that down fully smooth, and then hand sand it with a couple stages of wet sanding to get everything fully smoothed out. I did sand the entire thing all 360 degrees around, but for video's sake, I'm only showing you the bottom half just because it's the easiest camera angle to get there. So there we go, it's all ported. We're going to get everything thrown together here, just reverse the process. Start by bolting the intake manifold on. Once we get that on, we'll drop the injectors in, then drop the fuel rails on, then we can move on to our fuel lines. Quick tip here, when you're installing injectors, do not forget to lubricate the O-rings. These O-rings can tear, and if they do, you'll have a leak, and it makes a heck of a mess, and it just ruins your day. You think you have everything all buttoned up, ready to go, ready to take the car out, and it's the middle of the night, and you've got a leaky injector O-ring. So make sure you lube those up before you put the injectors in, or you put the rails onto the injectors. So the original plan here was I bought all nickel fittings here. I bought the braided hose with a rubber liner, which we cannot use, and I only bought that because it was cheap. When I spoke to XRP, they informed me that I needed a PTFE line, which I pretty much already knew, but the PTFE lines require a crimp on hose fitting. So the initial plan here was to get this stuff because it was cheap, build some hoses, ship them off to XRP, and they would make me the correct hoses with the PTFE hose and then ship them back, and these could just be decoration on the wall, what have you. ended up not being the case. I went ahead and made these lines based on that conversation with XRP, and then when I called back to get the information to ship them these lines, they informed me that there was actually a company locally that could make the lines for me. So I went through this whole process when I could have just taken the intake to a local shop, but it is what it is. It's great footage. So you can see as we build this rear line here, I also have the Rife fuel dual pressure sensor. That is a temperature and pressure sensor in one sending unit. Fuel temperature is a huge deal for your data logs, and a lot of people overlook that. So you can see we've got the Y block. We're going to make these lines up. Shout out to Cool Tools. This is a really cool little tool. It makes assembling these lines a whole lot easier, and it saves your fingers. Anyone that's done these braided lines knows what a pain in the butt it can be to put these lines together. What you do is you slide the fitting in, put the tool together, then you can slide the hose all the way in from the back in one shot. Then you take it apart, put the other end of your fitting in, and crank it all the way down. Side note, if you're building your own lines, after they're all completed and pressure tested and ready to go, blow them out. This creates a ton of residue inside the lines, and that residue can get into your injectors and clog your injectors. So once your lines are done, clean them out. A quick blast of air is all you should need. So we've got everything put together here. Now I'm going to pop these lines back off, and we're going to run them over to Fig Speed, which is other side of town, but it's still local. They're going to make up some new lines for us once we get there. Huge thank you to Fig Speed, because when we made these lines we actually had the wrong fitting, and they were able to swap it out for me the next day, no charge, no questions asked. So huge thanks to those guys. So you can see here the line just slides in, fitting slides on the end, and then the hydraulic pump crimps everything together. I was going to go with the black crimps, but when you go through this process, the finish on them gets really marred up. So I went with the nickel because it's less noticeable. So we're just now leaving Fig Speed, and unfortunately I wasn't able to get steel braided Teflon line hose. I was, however, able to get black braided Teflon line hose. I'm a little worried about the aesthetics of this, but we did get the nickel collars to break it up a little bit. Because it's Teflon lined, it still fits our needs, and they hooked us up with all new black fittings, so it should work out great. So we're going to head back to the shop, toss these lines on, and drop that engine in. So like I mentioned, they were able to hook me up with the fittings also, so this wasn't really part of the plan. I'd never planned on swapping everything over to black, but fortunately they had everything in stock. Everything's all the same brand, XRP, so it matches. It pleases my OCD. I can't stand when you have different brand of fittings and the anodizing is different shades of the same color. It drives me up a wall. So we're going to swap all these fittings out and then do the final assembly on this with the new PTFE lined hoses, which are safe for ethanol and methanol. Couple quick tips here. If you guys do not have one, I absolutely recommend getting a set of AN wrenches or an adjustable AN wrench like I'm using here. It will save the finish on your fittings and your fuel rails. Also, if you notice on this fuel pressure sensor, I do not have Teflon tape. I have a liquid Teflon paste. The Teflon tape, it can get into the line, it can clog the sensor, and it can clog the injectors. So no Teflon tape on your sensors. And lastly, I did end up finding the correct gasket for the intake manifold here. It is the OEM LT1 with the O-ring style OEM gasket. So we've got that in place, and now we can finally throw the throttle body on, bolt that thing down. I have it mounted upside down here, and I think I'm going to leave it that way. We'll see once I actually get things put together in the car. But for now, that's how it's going to stay. There you can see, there's no lip, nice smooth transition.
So the engine is ready to drop in. I'm gonna grab the cherry picker. We're gonna get it dropped in place. Once it's in though, we need to position it to make sure it is centered and square. We're gonna use some plumb bobs for that. And once we have that dialed in, we're gonna use a little trick with a laser to make sure that the angle is set correctly.
So this bar I put in actually in one of the very, very early videos, and it was just to keep the frame braced and keep it from moving around as we did the back half or we did the AA K member, but everything has been welded in place now, everything's secure, so this bar can go. Plus it's on our way for the engine, so I'm just cutting it out and I'm going to cut the ends of it off. The height of my chassis table was definitely a challenge here, and this was one thing that I did not think that far ahead. Trying to lift the engine high enough to get it in position with the car on the chassis table. I cut it really, really close. I was able to do it, but I'm going to look into a plan B when it comes time to remove this engine. It's going to go in and out several more times as we go through this build process, and doing it this way just wasn't really what I wanted to do, but it did work for this video. So this steel bar is clamped to the crank pulley, and what that's doing is it's giving us a perpendicular line to the crank inside the engine. And we're going to use 4 plumb bobs, 2 on each side, 1 off the front of this bar on either side, and 1 off the outside frame rail on either side. The measurements we're taking are to make sure that we have the same measurement from side to side, measuring from the center of the crank pulley to the outside of the frame rail. That ensures the engine is center. And then we also take a measurement from the plumb bob off that steel bar back to our motor plate mount. There's actually a bar right in front of my shoulder. That ensures the engine is square in the body. This is a trick that I read on a forum, and I wanted to try it to see if it would work. Essentially, to set the angle of the engine, the tilt or the lean back or whatever you want to call it, what you do is you set the rear end perfectly square at 0 degrees. You level it, and we're going to whip up this little tool, and it's going to bolt onto the back of the flex plate. Once we have the tool put together, we'll put a laser inside of it, and we will set our engine angle based on where our laser points, and the goal is to aim that laser directly at where the pinion will be located on the rear end. What that gives us is a 0 degree pinion angle at the rear end, and whatever our final number is at the engine, say it's 3 degrees, and we can then roll the rear end to split that number and make it 1.5 on each end.
It took a whole lot more than what you guys just saw, but the engine is finally in place. It ended up being crooked and off center, so I had to move it around quite a bit to dial it in. Once we have everything locked in place, the angle ended up being about 1.5 degrees up in the back, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is that the output shaft from the transmission is pointed dead at the center of the pinion. Right now the engine is just sitting on unistrut from our chassis table. To get everything actually mounted, we're going to use a motor plate from ICT Billet and a mid plate from Chris Alton. And these come oversized, so they're trimmed to fit. So we're gonna get them trimmed, then we're gonna make up some tabs, weld everything in, and bolt the plates on, and we're gonna call this a wrap.
So anytime you have something that's trimmed to fit, I think this goes without saying, make a cardboard template. This is just a recycled cereal box for my kids. It cost me nothing, but it's a great free way to mock this up. You can cut it. If you cut it too short, you can tape it back together, which you're gonna see me do here in a second. And in between every one of these cuts, I'm running over to the engine, test fitting it, marking it, coming back, cutting it, and repeating that process over and over until I have the template perfect. Then we transfer that template onto the piece. We can take that piece over to the bandsaw. bandsaw, remember to keep your speed low, let the blade do the work, don't force the material, and it'll cut right through it. I've had this bandsaw for a while, it cuts anything I throw at it. This is 1/4" thick aluminum, and it handles it with no problem. We're going to repeat the process for the other side. I chose to make a different template rather than just flip the other template over as a mirror, just in case something's not symmetrical. The motor plates might not be symmetrical. The engine is centered in the car, but I wanted just to have 2 templates. So this is the same process, just repeated for the other side of the engine. Motor plate tabs also come from Chris Alton, and they come as one big stamp set, and what you do is you break these little washers off, tack them onto the back, and that piece at the end is actually needs to be broke 90 degrees, and then once it's all done you can weld it all together, tack these little reinforcements on the back, and then it's ready to be tacked into the car. It's designed to mount on a tube mount, so you can see the little curl at the bottom there to go around the tube. It's actually a really cool setup, and I really dig these. I'm installing the motor plates here so that I can get the tabs in place. And the reason we're doing this is because I can simply clamp the tab to the plate. As long as the plate is securely fastened to the engine, that's going to locate my tab exactly where it needs to be. Frees up both of my hands to come in and weld everything in place. That way we have it locked in and it's exactly the right angle, the right position. Everything is dead on where we need it to be. Now I'm not trying to drill through this. This drill is actually too fast for aluminum, but I am trying to get a good mark on my holes, and then when I take this off, we'll take it back over to the drill press and drill those holes out on the drill press. Same thing for this side. We're going to tack those in place, mark the holes with the hand drill, pop the plate off, run it back to the drill press. Now I did forget to film the drill press portion of this, unfortunately, so the sort doesn't kind of make a lot of sense. You see I'm reinstalling the plates here. But what I did is, off camera, I went and drilled those holes, and now it's ready for final assembly. You guys might remember I mentioned on the motor plate process, make a cardboard template, and I did not follow my own advice here. I got a little arrogant with this. I figured the mid plate is super easy, as long as it fits in the tunnel, it's not a big deal. I was smart enough to creep up on it, and you'll see me make a lot of cuts here when I could have just made one big cut, and that's just because I wanted to kind of inch up on it to make sure I didn't go too far. At one point I thought I did go too far, ended up buying a new motor plate, realized that I did not make a mistake, so I sent that back and we continued with this one. But there are a lot of repetitive cuts. There are even more that are not on camera just because it got so repetitive. So make a template. If you're not going to make a cardboard template, at least creep up on it so you don't cut too much material away. It's easy to take more material off. It's a real pain in the butt to put more material back on. So I bought another set of those motor plate mounting tabs and tried to use those for the mid plate, and it didn't work. They're designed to mount to a tube. I'm mounting these onto the factory frame rail. They're also really narrow, and I needed them to stick in a good 2 to 3 inches to clear how the frame rail kind of curves in behind the control arm. So what I'm doing here is I'm using some 1/8" steel, and I used those for a template to trace those over. We're going to make our own tabs essentially here. So I'm going to cut this out, cut some reliefs to allow the bandsaw to make that curve. And once I have this whole thing cut out, I'm going to run it over to the grinder or the flap disc or whatever you have. Just kind of clean up the lines, clean up the edges, smooth everything out. Then we can move on to the drill press and start drilling some holes. Just like the motor plate, these may look symmetrical, they may look identical, but they're not. One side is actually about 1 inch wider than the other. The overall shape is the same, but the distance from the edge to the mounting holes is different from one side to the other. So after everything was cut out, we took it over to the flap disc or the grinder, whatever you have available, and kind of smooth those edges out. And now we're ready to move on to the drill press and punch out these holes. There's 2 holes on each bracket. They're all the same size. Keep your drill speed low, use some cutting fluid. This is easy stuff, it eats right through it. These are just a couple tabs that I had laying around, but they make it a lot easier when you're installing or moving the engine. You can remove the hardware and the motor plate, mid plate will just sit on this tab. That way you don't have to have it hooked up to a hoist the entire time. And then I have the reinforcement washers from the piece that I bought that didn't work, so I decided, well, we'll just use them since we have them. Center punch holes on the mid plate. And I ended up drilling 2 of the holes and decided to make sure everything was lined up. We're not going to drill the second ones. Instead, what I did was I drilled 2 holes and then bolted the tabs onto the motor plate and used the drill to pre-drill my secondary holes just like we did with the motor plate. That way we can punch those out on the drill press and have it dead on alignment and not have to worry about any inconsistencies. I didn't want any play in these holes whatsoever. You see we flip the bracket out of the way and punch through with the hole, and then when we go to reassemble these, it is a dead-on perfect fit. So I'm going to install this motor plate as one assembly with the tabs on it. I'm going to put all the bolts into the bell housing to hold everything together, and I'm actually going to MIG this on. I'm just tacking it for now to hold it in place. Once I tear down the car, we'll get in there with the TIG and run a nice bead down there. That'll lock everything in place. A quick double check of the measurements to make sure nothing moved. You can take off all these plumb bobs and our alignment bar on the crank pulley there. Have it. Engine is installed. Motor plates, mid plates locked in place.
There you have it, guys. The engine is finally installed. This is a huge step because it means we can now move on to other projects in the engine bay, things like headers, steering, turbo mounts. You're gonna have to catch all that on a future video. If you have questions or comments, drop them below. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on those notifications. Also, if you want to get a sneak peek of what's happening before we post the next video, don't forget to follow us on Facebook and the Gram. That's it for this one, guys. I'll see you on the next video.